let's start out with a financial topic. People come to me a lot and say, Lou, I think I want to get a trust. And my first question is, all right, who's trying to sell you a trust? Did you go to a luncheon somewhere and some attorney was giving away a free lunch and tried to tell you why you have to get a trust? And this used to happen a lot. It doesn't happen as much anymore because the need for trusts have dropped considerably. But they would come out and tell you, you need this credit shelter trust. You got to preserve your estate tax exemption, yours and your spouse's. And they used to use these trusts, which we used to call credit shelter trusts. And what you would do is, instead of your spouse inheriting your money, the trust would inherit your money, and it would preserve the estate tax exemption for each individual. And it used to be pretty low. The estate tax exemption, federally anyway, used to be $675,000. Which, many families have a net worth above that. So what they would do is they'd split the assets. Some of the assets would be in the husband's name. Some of the assets would be in the wife's name, and their beneficiary in their will would be their trust. And by doing that, well, the surviving spouse can take income from the trust. Ultimately, the kids would inherit the trust, and thereby you would preserve the $675,000 exemption for both spouses. All right? Sounds a little complicated, and it is. But nowadays, the estate tax exemption is $12 million per person and $24 million per couple without the trusts. So the need for this type of trust, which was the most popular trust, is no longer necessary. So a lot of people, I'm going to go over some trusts, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because very few people listening to me need a trust. But the purpose of me opening the show with this is to prove to you that you don't need a trust. Because a lot of people are conditioned through marketing, through attorneys scaring them, to think that they need a trust. And the average person does not need a trust. Now, the most common trust, one of the more common trusts now, is the Revocable Living Trust. Does nothing to save taxes. The only thing it does is bypasses probate. Your will has no effect on a trust. You name a beneficiary on a trust, they get the money after you die. But in a trust, the way it works is that there is a grantor of the trust, or they're also called settlers of the trust, the person who actually decides to give up control of their assets. They give it to a trustee. That trustee, in most trusts, it cannot be yourself. It's somebody else. It could be a child or a professional trustee. And they manage those assets. And then when you die, the assets go to the beneficiaries of the trust. That's one way you use a trust. And again, the only thing the Revocable Living Trust does is bypass the will. Which, why do you need to bypass the will? The will do the exact same thing. Now, some people say, well, a trust is private. Nobody will know what's in my will, how I want my assets to be bequeathed. Who cares? Do you really care if your will is in the probate office or the surrogate's court, that someone could actually look it up and see it? Unless you have, you're a celebrity or something and you don't want people to know your business. Who goes on the website of the surrogate court in Ocean County here in New Jersey and just looks at people's wills? You should get a life if that's what you're doing. But I've been on there. I've looked up wills on there for clients. People who have passed that are clients, and I'm helping settle the estate, and I'll bring up the will once it's filed and probated at the surrogate's court. But I don't care if somebody looks at my will. What's my will going to say if I die? All my assets go to my spouse. If my wife predeceases me, it goes equally amongst my 2 children. Ooh, I don't want that to get out. So again, the Revocable Living Trust I laugh at it when I see it. People come in with these Revocable Living Trusts. And the Revocable Living Trust, a lot of people get the trust from the attorney. You spend a couple of $1,000s to have it drawn up, and then you never move the assets into the title of the trust. You have to rename assets. You have to change your bank accounts, your brokerage accounts, your deed on your house, and name the trust as the owner. Now, there's 2 different ways of looking at trusts. There's something called a living trust, where it's formed when you're alive. And there's something called a testamentary trust that comes into effect when you die. They're totally separate things. Now, in a testamentary trust, you don't lose control of those assets because they're your assets until you die. When would you use a testamentary trust? You'd use a testamentary trust to say you had a special needs child and they're getting benefits from the state and they can't have any assets, or they're on disability or whatever. They can't get any assets. So the trust inherits your money. For their benefit, the trustee can give them money as they need it, but they never own the money. It's never their asset. It's always owned by the trust until some time in the future. And that's one way to preserve the benefits for somebody. That trust comes into effect at your death. It's part of your will. All testamentary trusts are part of a will. Another reason you would do a testamentary trust is, say you have a child who is a spendthrift. Or suppose you have a child with certain vices. They do drugs, they're an alcoholic, they gamble. You're afraid they're going to blow it on wine, women, and song. So what you do is, when you die, the trust inherits the assets. There's a trustee who runs the assets, who decides how to invest it. And the trustee's job, similar to an executor, is has to follow the rules that are in the trust itself. And those rules could be anything you desire it to be. You could say in this trust that my one son, John, who's the beneficiary of this trust, and his sister, Mary, is the trustee. I want Mary to disperse to John $10,000 a year. And when John turns 55, he can get all the rest of the money. That's a typical spendthrift trust situation. Now, how is John going to feel that, maybe his other brother and sisters got all their money at once, but he didn't get his? Well, that's the way he lived his life, and his parents don't want him to hurt himself with it. They want to make sure that he's okay with this money. If you know your son or daughter are doing drugs, would you want them to get hundreds of thousands of dollars just to kill themselves? Of course not. Or do you want them to spend it, be a shopaholic and spend it away so it dwindles to nothing in a couple of years, or gamble it away? These are very, very common trusts. I have clients that have this kind of a trust. They've come to me and they've said, Lou, I got 3 children. 2 of them are fine with money. I have no problem with them. But the third one, not so good. And so I told them, all right, well, what you do then is you set up a testamentary trust in your will. Well, that third that belongs to that one child goes into the trust, and name one of your other children as trustee. Now, this can cause a lot of friction in the family. Because usually, first of all, the one that doesn't get all their money is not going to be happy about it. So you're going to have that issue right away. Unless you discuss with them in advance, which you should. I always say that the will is a terrible place to keep secrets. So you should discuss with your family as you're moving towards the end of your life and you're setting up things, or things are unusual. Say one of your children are going to get more money than the other. Why would you do that? Well, my one son is a doctor and he makes $500,000 a year. My other son struggles because he's a construction worker when he has work. My one son that's a doctor, his house is paid off and he has no problems with retirement. My other son's struggling, he's paycheck to paycheck. I want him to get most of my assets. I would think that's reasonable. Wouldn't you want to help the child who could most benefit with your wealth? But if you don't discuss it with the doctor child of yours, and they find out after you die, it could cause bad feelings. Well, did mom not love me as much? And that's why it's so important to discuss these things. You do not want bad blood between your children after you leave. Do you want to leave a mess behind? That's the way you do it. You keep secrets in your will. And I'm a big believer of having a family meeting. When you've decided what you want to do in your will, in your trust, whatever it is, you have to have a family meeting. Or at least meet with your children individually and let them know what's in your will and why it's there. This doesn't mean I don't love you any more or less. It just means that I feel that this would be better for the family, for your one brother or your one sister who struggle. You don't need it. Now, some people will never do that. I know, Mike, I got a lot of clients that say, I do for one, I do for the other. And I don't necessarily agree with that. Unless they have the same level of need. But I got off of trust a little bit. But trust are the same thing. If you're going to be, like I said, if you're going to make a spendthrift trust for one of your children because you don't trust them with the money, you better discuss it with them. Now, many times in a trust, and I recommend this, that you should give the trustee, the person managing the trust. First of all, don't put that on somebody that does not want to do it, that's not capable of doing it, that doesn't have a relatively strong backbone, because they're going to be browbeaten by the beneficiary of the trust, especially when they learn that the trustee has leeway. And you don't want to be so rigid in a trust where, like I said before, John gets $10,000 a year until he turns 55 and then he can get the balance. That's too rigid. Because what happens if something happens to the one son and he needs more money? He's been injured. He's ill. He wants to buy a house. He's cleaned up his ways. And the trustee feels that he can handle more money. You want to give that trustee the ability to give more than you stated originally in the trust. The problem with that is, again, once the one beneficiary son knows that the trustee can give him more than the trust said, he's going to browbeat him. And that's why that person better be strong and better have a good backbone. And you really don't want to have bad blood between these two brothers, so you got to make sure that you do it right. And everybody understands what's going on here. There's also other terms in a trust that you need to know about, and that's revocable and non-revocable. Irrevocable, I should say. It's exactly what it says. A revocable trust can be changed or terminated by the grantor of the trust, the person who started it, during their lifetime. And that's true of a revocable living trust. When I see people with revocable living trust, I say close the trust down. It serves you no purpose. It just complicates your life. Let's do away with it. Because again, the reason to have it is no longer valid. I mean, what's the big deal? Again, people have this misconception, and I don't know if they're misled by attorneys or whatnot, that by having a trust, it saves you in taxes. Well, there may be certain types of trust that do that, but most trusts don't. They really don't. So I tell them it's a revocable living trust. The term revocable means we could stop it. And also with a revocable living trust, there's no strings attached. You can take that money out at any time. When you have an irrevocable trust, as the name implies, you cannot change it once it's established. Also, there's irrevocable trusts that take place when you die. They cannot be changed. Now, living trust that you establish while you're alive could be either revocable or irrevocable. But testamentary trusts, ones that are come into effect when you die, can only be irrevocable. And that's what trusts really are. And like I said, what's the purpose of trusts? In the old days, you used to talk, trusts were for rich people. You've heard the term trust fund baby, never worked a day in his life. He has this big multi-million-dollar trust fund and he gets $200,000 a year. And but trust, can be a versatile vehicle sometimes. Another thing that trusts are used for is, say you're trying to protect your estate from nursing home costs. You want to be able to get on Medicaid. Well, one thing you could do is gift your money to your children and start a 5-year look-back period. But maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you don't want that money in your children's hands right now for various reasons. Maybe they have marital problems, debt problems, whatever. Maybe you're afraid they're going to get sued and you're going to lose the money that way. You could put it in what we call a Medicaid trust, where you put the money in an irrevocable trust. You can't touch it. And if 5 years go by, that money is exempt from nursing home costs. This has the same exact effect as gifting the money away. They're going to look back 5 years to see when you established a trust. The beneficiaries of the trust are your ultimate beneficiaries. So when you do die, the assets in that trust would be distributed just like your will would do it. And that's a good thing to do. You got to name a trustee. You can't be you. It's got to be somebody else. Now look, most people in the family, when they do an irrevocable trust, they're going to name one of their children as the trustee. And for all intents and purposes, they're going to still determine where the money goes, how it's invested, and so forth. The trustees are going to be the one to call the broker. But you think if I'm a trustee of my dad's trust, even though it's irrevocable and I'm a trustee, I'm not going to do what my dad tells me to do with it? Of course I am. Then there's a generation skipping trust. You know, you want money to go to your grandkids. You want to skip over your own children. There's a qualified personal residence trust where you could put your home in the trust and get it out of your estate. Again, this used to be important for estate tax purposes. Not sure now. You could put insurance in a trust. The trust can own it and be the beneficiary of it. And then your kid's ultimately the beneficiary of it. That keeps it off your gross estate. Again, for most people that don't have $12 million, it doesn't matter. I mentioned before the spendthrift trust. You could also do a charitable trust where you put the money in the trust and you get the income from the trust, and then ultimately when you die, the charity gets the money, and you can get certain tax deductions for it. You'll hear that politicians will set up what's called the blind trust, where they can't see, the trustee invests the money, but they can't see what the assets are in it. And that prevents a conflict of interest or insider trading or whatever. Although insider trading in Congress is totally legal. Isn't it interesting how they always pass laws that make things good for them, but not for you? You trade on inside information, you can go to jail. They trade on inside information, and Congress has the top of the line inside information on industries and companies that they're going to approve tax breaks for, or so forth. How do you think Nancy Pelosi got to be a $150 millionaire? Oh, did you hear this week she's buying a $25 million waterfront home in Florida, trying to get away from her own liberal state. Unbelievable. But that's where you would use a blind trust. Put all your money in it. A lot of times presidents will do that and so forth. You name a trustee and they'll manage it for you down the line. So trust, most people who are listening to me, unless you have special needs child, a child that you don't want to get all your assets because they'll blow it in one way or the other, or you want to put money in a trust to get it out of your name for Medicaid purposes. Now, again, in these kind of irrevocable trusts, it's very important that you understand and you have other assets because you can't touch them. You can't touch them. So, I mean, if you're going to need that money, you should not put it in an irrevocable trust because you can't get it out. Now, you can get income out of it in times and things like that, but to try to get the principal of the trust out, virtually impossible. So, if you think you need a trust, I would talk to a certified financial planner first. Why would I do that besides an attorney? Because an attorney has a conflict of interest. The attorney's going to make thousands of dollars setting up a 10-page document that's already a template on his computer that he just got to fill in the details and he's going to print it out. Cost him virtually nothing and, a small amount of time. And they'll charge you thousands of dollars depending on how complex the trust is. And I've seen clients come to me with trusts that are just so complex and so unnecessary. And thousands of dollars were spent on it that really didn't need to be spent.